Welcome to another edition of Underground Strategy. Today we'll be talking about North Africa, the North African campaign in the Second World War. And we have the honor of having Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jean-Pierre Scherman. He's a friend of the podcast, a personal friend, and he's a distinguished soldier and officer of the SANDF. Getting back to the North African campaign, it was a campaign fought not only for territory, but for control, for supply routes, and then access to very important resources in the north and in the Middle East. The desert became the setting for one of the most mobile and unpredictable theaters of the Second World War, and we see names like Rommel coming to the fore. Tanks clashed and generals' reputations were forged, and young men from across the world, South Africa too, fought many miles from their home. JP, thank you so much for joining us today. And we want to get straight into that first question. As blitzkrieg is raging in Europe, why did North Africa become such a key battleground for both the Axis and the Allied powers?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate being able to speak to you and to our listeners today. North Africa is a critical battlefield during the Second World War. It is of immense strategic importance, not only to the Allies, but to the Axis forces as well. The region's geography, its resources, its proximity to vital supply routes makes it a focal point in the broader conflict that is the Second World War. If we look and see just the strategic importance of North Africa, it dominates and controls a key supply route. The Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal were vital shipping routes for both sides. The Allies relied on the Suez Canal to maintain access to their colonies, particularly the UK, Britain, to their colonies in Asia and Africa, as well as safeguarding oil supplies from the Middle East. For the Axis powers, controlling North Africa would have allowed them to cut off Britain from this empire and resources in Asia and Africa, even isolating it further in the war already. Access to oil, obviously, it's vitally important even today. Oil was a critical resource during the Second World War, fueling military operations and industrial production. Oil is used in multiple different variants and forms. It's not only just for petroleum products, it's used in thousands of other products. So access to oil was vital. The Axis sought to secure this Middle East oil fields by advancing through North Africa, and while obviously also simultaneously trying to deny it to the Allied forces. Another important thing was that North Africa serves as a second front. From mid-1941, the Germans and Axis had launched Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union, and the Soviets are hard-pressed. And to be able to open up a second front, and even if it drew one division away from Russia and deploy it into North Africa, in essence, it draws a lot more than that. But that opening of a second front is vital for the Allied cause to try and relieve a little bit of the pressure that the Red Army is under. Geopolitical position, it also is a stepping stone into Europe. The Allies look at the map and they see, well, if we can control North Africa, we have the potential to then engage the Axis in Italy. We have the potential to engage Axis in Greece if we choose to. We can maybe go through Spain. It gives them options. It means that aren't limited only to a cross-channel assault, which the Germans are expecting from the UK onto French soil. So it gives them that geopolitical choice in strategic means to where are we going to hit back when we do hit back.
It's fascinating how key that was. And when I think about North Africa, the first name that comes to my mind is Rommel. And I think he gets promoted up. He's clearly very skilled. 4 years before, early 1941, he was maybe a lieutenant colonel. And now he's a general. He gets this nickname, the Desert Fox. It excites the imagination. But how were those early defeats and then that back and forth between the British and the Germans?
Amongst his enemies, he's far better known and I think admired today than what he is by his own countrymen. Western military schools across the Western sphere, from the US to the UK to South Africa, still study General Rommel's tactics that he employs. He was a master of his craft, let's be honest with that. And his leadership style was perfectly suited for the desert. Now, the desert is almost exactly the same as what an ocean is. So a naval commander would find himself very much at home in a desert type of environment, large open spaces, no terrain to worry about. It's all about time and distance. And Rommel is a master of being able to manipulate forces in such a way that he can bring his forces together at a certain time and place to his advantage. But the desert being the desert, the most critical aspect of any desert operation is logistics. If you don't have water, you aren't going anywhere. If you don't have fuel, you're going anywhere. And North Africa was particularly devoid of any infrastructure. Now, in some ways, that's great. You can do whatever you want to do, and there's no civilian population to really take into consideration, which is always an important consideration when you're doing military planning. But North Africa, there wasn't large towns to worry about and infrastructure. So you could just have it and just go for it as far as what you wanted to. And Rommel realizes this. The little bit of infrastructure there is, he uses to his advantage, but he plans and he has a certain flair, which is what appeals to all of us, is that he takes immense risks. If you look at it from a contemporary military thing, this is like most officers wouldn't even consider take. It's just too dicey, too chancy. And Rommel does it on a regular basis. And what makes him famous is he gets away with it most of the time.
I mean, and JP, yourself also for our listeners, an army officer, senior officer. Personally, what do you think? When you study that kind of campaigns, do you think like, goodness me, I mean, no risk, no reward, he who dares wins, etc. But do you think sometimes he goes a bit far?
I am by nature far more cautious as an officer as what General Rommel would have been. Obviously, he has experience that I will never have in my life. But I look at it and I can appreciate, because I don't think he's reckless. There's a difference between recklessness and just being incredibly audacious. I am far more reserved as a person. I don't come out of the Prussian military system, which is a perfect product of it. The German schools of the 1930s, if you look and see some of the best military officers of the German schools, the Models and the Guderians and the Rommels, they were very blessed in having very, very good officers' schools, and they were taught this. And we try to emulate it even today. It's like 80 years later, and we're still trying to emulate in many aspects Blitzkrieg and the tactics that the Germans used. Now, Rommel just was very, very good at it. Me personally, I would shy away. My military training and background doesn't lend itself to these really, really risky maneuvers. He's did, and that's why he's famous, and I'm not.
Give it time, JP, give it time. Our good old army gymnasium, in Heidelberg, I mean, it's still not bad, though.
Obviously, it's always going to be a toss-up. As an officer, you really have only two things to worry about: your mission and your men. And of the two, the mission is always going to be the predominant one. You can't send people into battle knowing that there's an absolute chance that they are going to suffer casualties and not take that into consideration. Now, Rommel obviously balances these, and what he finds an acceptable risk, I admire him for it. I think, wow. And his men, to their credit. Now, you can be risky as whatever you want to be, but if your soldiers aren't capable of pulling off what you're asking them to do, then you never go. So the German army that comes to Africa is exceptionally well trained, exceptionally well organized, exceptionally well motivated. And those all play a part. And strangely enough, we all know, or I hope the leaders know, that Rommel goes to Africa initially to assist the Italians who are really having a hard time. And as you can see how Rommel rubs off his leadership and his style and his enthusiasm rubs off on his Italian counterparts. And a lot of, we like them to tease the Italians a little bit, the Second World War historians. But the Italian army under Rommel is a vastly better military organization than what it was before his arrival. So that just shows the powerful tool that a good leader has on the battlefield.
Yeah, no, that point's well made, and we take that point, JP. And, for our listeners in the future podcast that we have lined up, we will talk about Operation Boreas, which to a lot of the wider world is not really well known. It's something that JP will forgive me for saying it. He's an operational officer and soldier. He's now, of course, in academia and teaching, but his previous life was very much in that operational space. And that's a campaign that needs a solid revision. He's the man for it. He's been doing a lot of good work, and he also served in it. So when he speaks about these things, he does lean on experience and not just the books. And we respect all the academics out there, and we welcome that big discussion. I want to go to what the South Africans were doing there, because many of our listeners will say, right, we have North Africa, we have Rommel. They might have these other names like Montgomery later. They might have the SAS being founded, these kind of now almost myth-like stories coming from this, JP. But also the South Africans were there very far away from home. Can you tell us maybe just a little bit about, just what they were doing there?
Well, South Africa's entry into the Second World War has always been a bit of a rough and tumble story, to say the least. But our entry was not by any means guaranteed. It came to a vote down in our parliament, and it passed with a very slim majority that South Africa would actually join forces. Our history, a large portion of our population was either neutral or decidedly anti-British. And a lot of population, even today, if you look at the surnames amongst a large portion of the European population, you can see the German ancestry coming straight through. My own surname, my own family comes from Bavaria. So there's a fair amount of German bloodlines through South Africa. But that being said, when the call is made and South Africa decides to go to war, unlike many other of the minions, because of this history, we are a volunteer-only force. And that makes us quite unique within the Second World War, where there's no ever conscription, no draft is ever applied in South Africa. Every single person who puts on a uniform signs an oath to say that he's volunteering and then goes off. Now, our first entry is East Africa and fighting the Italians, but that basically just whets our appetite. We end up, by the end of 1941, as a coalition, a United Nations of armies up in Africa, and our arrival coincides almost accidentally with the arrival of Rommel, literally in the same time frame that the two groupings actually arrive in North Africa. Rommel coming to assist the Italians, and we as Africans coming to essentially assist the British army, who's also been facing off there in this thing. Now, we have committed 2 complete infantry divisions to the struggle. One is very well trained and very well experienced coming out of East Africa. The other one is a complete novice. It's just spent a year training in South Africa, and this will be its first major introduction to warfare. And these 2 divisions will have markedly different world experiences during the war. They will end up having different fortunes as the war goes on. But essentially, we've come to join on the British side. The battle is flowing. It is first, it's almost like a tennis match. One side has got the advantage, then the other side got the advantage. And so the battle is flowing up and down the coastline. And I'm talking about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers worth of flow. But that is essentially what we are seeing through the first 2 years of this war. First, one side has the advantage and they advance quite spectacularly against their opponents. And then they run out of logistics. And then the other side, whose logistics lines have just been shortened, gets a chance and they push them all the way back again. And so we've had this backwards and forwards. And South Africa plays its part in that story.
If you're dialed in, drop us a review on your app. Watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to join the conversation. All right, back to it.
And as this back and forward happens, we then have a critical point, and that kind of lives on in infamy a little bit, in memory, and a lot's being said about the surrender at Tobruk. It's a pivotal moment. Churchill seeing Roosevelt at the time in Washington, and he says, "I'm the most miserable Englishman in America since Burgoyne," and he says that's the British general who had surrendered at Saratoga. And then, he's really dismayed by this, right? Like the surrender. And of course, this goes on in South African military history and historiography. JP, can you tell us a little bit about that, what happened in June 1942?
You already mentioned that it is an incredibly, even though it's 80 years later, even within South Africa today, if you mention Tobruk, you're going to get a response from a certain grouping of population. My grandfather was there, my husband was there. It has left a very bitter taste within a large portion of South African society. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. I told you that there were 2 divisions initially deployed to North Africa, and it happens that the least experienced, the 2nd South African Division, is assigned as a garrison for Tobruk. Now, the problem emanates from ordering. In other words, what orders does this garrison receive? They're behind the lines. In front of them is the whole Gazala, a defensive position that the Allies have set up. So they aren't on the front lines. They're unexpected to be on the front lines. And the orders that they receive from the British higher headquarters is that we will not defend this locality again. Tobruk had been defended earlier in the campaign by firstly Australians and then by the British Army itself once it was cut off in that backwards and forwards flow that we spoke about earlier. But the Royal Navy had already mentioned that to supply it while it was cut off had cost so much effort, so much shipping had been lost, that they were not prepared to go through a second round of this. And the South Africans were of the idea that they would not be required to defend it again. Now, the British didn't expect to lose the Battle of Gazala either, so it didn't really mean much when they said, okay, fine. But when Rommel comes charging around, and one of his more famous campaigns is the Battle of Gazala, Rommel bypasses the whole defensive position that the Allies have set up, and in a couple of crushing assaults. Using Rommel is very, very good. I think we've already established that. But he's very good in the sense that he husbands his resources better than what the British do, the Allies do. And he uses his anti-tank weapons masterfully. He doesn't use tank versus tank. He uses his anti-tank guns to destroy basically the British armour, who are acting as a shield to all the British infantry. And with their shield removed, Rommel now has freedom of movement. And he's able to advance on Tobruk unopposed. And the South Africans are caught in a rock and a hard place. They are told at literally 0.99 that the plan changed because the British are feeling vulnerable and their morale has just hit rock bottom. They've lost another battle to Rommel. And like you said, Churchill is in America. He doesn't want to hear of another defeat. He's trying to convince the Americans to give more money, give more aid, give more everything. He's already standing with his hat in his hand in front of Roosevelt. And the last thing, as a beggar, he wants to tell him is, listen, we just got our handed to us again. So when the news arrives that they're thinking about leaving and abandoning Tobruk and moving back to the Egyptian border, he says, under no circumstances, keep Tobruk. Now, that's easy to say, but if you're a soldier in Tobruk who hasn't been prepared, hasn't built up the defensive positions, Tobruk's perimeter is almost 50 kilometers, and it's an impossible task. And given to an inexperienced division, inexperienced commander, their commander is General Klopper. He's only been the commander for 3 months. So he has got no real experience yet as a divisional commander. And the only reason that he becomes the commander in the first place is that the British Army has a rule that no reserve force or citizen force soldiers can become divisional commanders. So when the previous commander is left, of the 3 brigade commanders, even though he is by far the most junior, he's the only PF officer in the group. The other 2 are citizen force. One is a policeman, Bobby Palmer, and the other one is a citizen force. So by default, he becomes the divisional commander, even though he's the most junior of the lot. And Rommel, who's obviously just taken the British armour to pieces, his morale is sky high. His soldiers' morale is sky high. And he just literally storms into Tobruk. And they try valiantly to try and stop him, but it's over in like 24 hours. What irritates South Africans today is that the blame is placed specifically in the international community on the South Africans. Now, there was a big board of inquiry after the debacle. It took place in Cairo that December. And when all the evidence was put on the table, it was clear that the Africans had no real reason to feel ashamed in any ways. The problem started with the British High Command. Their contradictory orders, their poor planning, and the fact that they lost the Battle of Gazala doomed Tobruk. But they couldn't say that. So the findings of the board were basically classified as secret and were never released during the entire war to try and save British prestige in the fact that they had actually gone and messed this up quite spectacularly.
We look forward to some listener feedback. We look forward to our listeners writing to us so we can continue that debate. And I think that's a lot about that is that kind of high command, Churchill and his senior generals being involved. On Hitler's side, it was the same. You mentioned Rommel. He might have been favored at one point, but ultimately he would fall out of favor on that end. We've touched on some of the higher ups, the senior officers and general officers. What about the people on the ground? Behind all of these sweeping maneuvers, behind all of the legends that we built afterwards and the myths. And maybe this touches on some of your research, JP, and what was that lived experience, the day-to-day soldier experiences in North Africa?
Firstly, I told you that everybody's a volunteer. Now, that means that originally that you've got the certain mindset of a soldier. Now, when the South Africans arrive in Egypt, they are obviously going to experience a bit of culture shock. Egypt being a Muslim country, an Arab country, most people had never left their province before joining the military. Most had never, if you weren't born by the ocean, a lot of the people coming from the old Transvaal and the Free State had never seen the ocean before they're joining the military. So for them, this is a major change in their worldview. Now they get to Egypt, they're introduced to the desert. They're coming from a South Africa that's very, very segregated along racial lines. Now, Cairo is, everything goes in Cairo. It's very much a wild, wild west. Alexandria is exactly the same. So you can imagine South African soldiers going on a bit of R&R, rest and relaxation, a couple of days off, into Cairo, and there's everything and anything that's possible. The racial lines are completely blurred. There's Australians, there's New Zealanders, there's Indians, there's English, there's Egyptians. So in that sense, the whole social dynamic of a young South African soldier, it would have been quite an eye-opener for him. But just the environment that he is, the physical environment would have been quite strange. The desert, with South Africa doesn't really have the type of desert that Egypt has. Our topography doesn't match itself to that. So being in Egypt, in the Sahara Desert, that would have been obviously a major difference in them. Then, like your daily routines for a soldier, like any soldier, anyone's ever served in uniform, you know that it's 23 hours of pure boredom followed by 1 hour of pure terror. And they would have experienced exactly the same. Months and months in the desert, doing training, doing like these boring things. And then for one day, something happens and it's petrifying. And that is the typical life of a soldier during any of these conflicts. The psychological stress, obviously, of anybody, most of them are youngish, I would say in their 20s. They are isolated. We're very fortunate. We can contact our families and we can internet and we have cell phones and everything. For them, it was a letter on a postcard, which might take months to get back home again via shipping, if you're lucky, email. So they're going to be isolated from their family. So that means that your friend, your immediate colleagues become your family. And that is a way of coping. To survive shared hardship is this camaraderie. And you see it even today amongst veterans of all sorts, that the bonds that are formed in the military, unlike other occupations, other professions, these bonds seem to be exceedingly strong. And you see all across the globe, there's always these military reunions. And this is exactly the same that happens in North Africa. And that's also true for the Axis soldiers. Even the German Africa Corps had very strong after the war reunions and membership clubs and all these things. The friends you make, those bonds just don't dissolve over time.
I agree with you. And, just as you mentioned, just from personal experience, it is very much the case. And I think even people serving in militaries in different cultures, in a meeting is often an easy way to connect, and to build that rapport.
Absolutely. If you've ever been walk into a dinner and you don't know anybody there, but if there's somebody that served in the military, irrespective of where, how, what form or what, you immediately have this connection with this person. Because basic training is basic training. There's only so much you can do, and it makes no difference where it is in the world. The basic ideas are still the same. You really have this commonality of thought process, of experiences. And I've used the military as a way of navigating through my entire adult life, and it served me pretty well.
If you ever thought, these guys, they deserve a drink, you're not wrong. Buy us a beer at undergroundstrategy.com/support. Fuel the banter, fund the strategy. Cheers. Back to the action.
I would agree with that, and me too. You'd mentioned Tobruk, and this question is maybe a little bit unfair. We've had a situation in South Africa. We had deployed forces in the Congo. We've had these missions going on a long time, just for our listeners' benefit. And it's changed over the recent years to be a Southern African Development Community mission. And then over the last few months, for those following the news, our own soldiers, our South African soldiers, were under attack. They responded quite valiantly. But as I watched the end of it, it did feel a little bit like a surrender. And this idea of Tobruk did pop into my head. JP, it might be an unfair comparison because, they might have left with their weapons and so and so. But I don't know, does it feel like there's still some kind of chiming over there, or do you think that it's just a very different context?
Unfortunately, there's not that much information really available at the moment to be able to make an accurate, and the only source of information we have is the press. And the press is notoriously unreliable. I can see the basic linkage between it, but I'd be very hesitant to go further than that simply because we just don't know enough. We haven't got any official reports. We haven't got any unofficial reports even yet from the soldiers on the ground. We don't know what the decision-making process was. We don't even know what their real orders were that they received. We don't know anything. We have a couple of CNN snippets, and that's so difficult to be able to make a call on something like that on such limited information.
No, it doesn't. But I think you're right. I think for a lot of us, when we saw that, it was more that emotional reaction as opposed to, what's actual facts.
Obviously, I'm using Twitter. X is my major source of information on this because the SANDF is notoriously poor at communication. The whole PR thing, we just are terrible at it. So if you hear anything, it's going to be genuinely negative. So I am advert to play into that. Yes, it was a total disaster. We did ourselves in. Because my experience has been that the general South African soldier and officer tries really hard. I don't mean to be horrible in this, but you and I both have been on UN missions. And I've seen how other countries do not have Africa's best interests at heart. They deploy to Africa without really trying. They're there for whatever reason they're there for. And for all our faults, South Africa has genuinely tried our level best with our limited resources. Our soldiers have gone out day in, day out, rain, sunshine, and they've tried. They've tried to make a difference. They've tried to improve the lives, be it in the DRC, be it in the Sudan, be it in Burundi. They've put their lives on the line, and I don't think our greatest African citizenship understands that with all the faults and with all the drama that is the SNDF, generally, these men and women have done sterling work with limited resources, limited opportunities, and these places are not tourist destinations. These are not friendly places to be going and working. We spoke about how horrible North Africa was. Now, the Sudan is exactly the same type of area. Now, the DRC is exactly the opposite. Triple canopy jungle. I always tell my students that when it rains in the DRC, the raindrop is as big as a bucket. Because it literally is, it's just, you're outside and you go from dry to soaking in 30 seconds. It just pours water. If you're looking at the ground, it looks like the water is coming up from between your feet. It's just an insane amount of water very quickly. So these are the type of environments that we send our soldiers into, and I think it's grossly unfair for somebody sitting on his armchair, drinking his beer, to comment and say, listen, this was bad or this was good.
Sure.
You have no idea what it was. You have absolutely no clue.
No, I think that's fair. To the point, I've seen what you have mentioned too. It isn't easy. I suppose that daily struggles, you had mentioned about those in North Africa, and that just human daily struggles. You wake up and you want to have a cup of coffee and you have to do this, and there are insects, or there's this, or it's hot.
My family knows that in my home, I have like pet aversion to cold water. A year of cold showers in the DRC has cured me for the rest of my life. If I have an option, I will never take a cold shower ever again in my life. Eventually, I just could not face going to the ablution facility knowing that even though it was hot, it's muggy, it's steamy, that ice cold water showers. Today, I still tend to, even as South Africa's generally got a hot temperature, I still shower with the water. Instead of cooking, I set it onto lava and shower hot.
I totally get that. Yeah, no, there's a couple of more examples. I can't say too much, on this podcast, that I can think of. I'm going to go back to, and I'm sorry for everyone for our diversion there, with what's happened in Congo. And like I said, and as JP's well explained, for me and for many others, it's more like emotional response when you see what's happened and, you see those people, then you just want the best for them. And for us, and also, I'll be honest, for the Congo, we've been there for a long time. I think the first mission is 2003, maybe, training missions maybe before. So it's been a long time, and to see that happen like that really was, like I said, maybe more an emotional response or just feeling a bit of heartache at that. But, we'll wait for those full reports, as JP said. And just to round up this discussion, we're going to go back to North Africa now from Central Africa, where we were for a moment. The tide eventually turns. We see Bernard Montgomery come in, a man with a tremendously powerful and controversial personality, but brilliant also. And he then takes the reins, and Montgomery later reflects in his own words, he saw it as the turning point of the war in the desert when he landed, and then with Operation Torch, etc. Can you speak to us a little bit about that, JP, how things worked with Montgomery, were the South Africans involved afterwards, and just how the whole thing ends in North Africa?
Well, firstly, the South Africans are involved. I initially told you that we sent up 2 divisions. Now, by the time that Montgomery arrives, we've essentially lost an entire division worth of soldiers already. We've lost a brigade from the 1 division, and we've lost 2 brigades from the other division. So we amalgamate all the survivors into a new division. It still stays under the old division's name, but it is an amalgamation of 2 brigades from the 1st division and a brigade from the 2nd division in. We are given a task as an infantry division of protecting the coast and participate in the great stand at Al Alamein, which, for interesting sake, South Africans actually build a large portion of that defensive position ourselves. When we actually get to North Africa, one of the first tasks of the junior division is the building of those defensive positions. So it's almost deja vu to be able to say that the Africans end up using those very defensive positions that they constructed in the Great Battle for El Alamein. The focus is very much on the armor, which we don't have. We are an infantry-based infantry division. So Montgomery is the antithesis of Rommel, where Rommel is flashy and daring and Montgomery is calculating. Many would call him boring, but he's boring in a very good military way. He's a planner and he sets out and he has a schedule and he sticks to it. And where Rommel is fortunate in that the majority of these forces only come from the Italian army and the German army. Montgomery has got United Nations of people under his command and control. He's got from different parts of the globe, and he has to amalgamate all and merge all these people into a solid fighting force. So you must also understand the circumstances that he's faced with. He has one big great advantage is that his logistics is a lot stronger than what Rommel's is. He's getting far more weapons, far more soldiers, far more reinforcements, fuel, and he has the air arm. The Allies have, by that stage, been able to, while they are on stalemate on the ground, in the air, the Allies have started to come into the ascendancy. The Desert Air Force is basically ruling the skies now. And in the desert where you have no terrain to hide under, there's no trees, there's no place, it's like fighting on a billboard, on a billiard table. Whoever dominates the air has an incredible advantage. And with the air war starting to lean towards the Allies' favor, that plays a critical role in what will happen. Operation Lightfoot is Montgomery's assault on Rommel's defensive line, and it's a plodding meat grinder of an assault. But he can afford the meat grinder. He can afford to lose 1,000 tanks. Rommel cannot, because Rommel's logistic lines can't support these losses. And eventually, it's logistics that decides the Battle of North Africa more than anything else. Montgomery is just able to keep at this meat grinder so long that eventually Rommel is forced to withdraw because he can't replace what he's losing. He hasn't got enough to be able to counterattack. He's bleeding, and Montgomery just carries on, and he won't make the same mistake that his predecessors made by trying to adopt Rommel's tactics and charge it after him. He will take his time, he will build up his logistics, and he will follow at his own pace and his own time. So he will use his logistics as his ice up his sleeve. And then, obviously, we have Torch. Torch is the official entry of the Americans, conflict right at the end. But the Americans have been looking for a way to strike back. The Japanese, who bring them into the war in 1941 in December by attacking Pearl Harbor, have got an alliance with Germany. And the Americans make a conscious decision. They're fighting a war on two fronts. They're fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, and they're fighting the Germans in the European theater. And the Americans make a conscious decision that Germany is principal enemy number one. They will give the majority of their combat power, firstly to Europe, and then they will switch over to the Pacific. Now, America is a immense country and has got military potential that is quite scary. And if you look and see how much they actually commit to both theaters, it's mind-boggling. But the Americans need a way to be able to join the European theater. And North Africa proves to be a very good teething ground for them. They land in what is French-controlled North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, hoping that the French will not resist. The French do resist, and it turns into a bit of a debacle. But the Americans come ashore, and then you see the rise of somebody that's molded a lot like Rommel in the form of General Patton coming to the fore now. He's one of the landing group commanders, but he's not the supreme commander. And he will very quickly take a very dominant leadership position through his flair, through his style, very much in Rommel's mold. And Patton will come out as one of the most famous of the American commanders out of North Africa. The Americans will learn some harsh lessons. The Germans have been obviously at this game a lot longer. And at Kasserine Pass, they will catch the Americans napping, and they will cause them some serious heartache there and give them a good bloody nose. But squeezed between Montgomery from the east and the Americans from the west. By this stage, Rommel's already left North Africa. He's been withdrawn. He's got a new job. His job is to defend France from the impending invasion. So he's been in charge of the whole western defenses of France. General von Arnim takes over as commander of the Axis forces. But he's literally outgunned and outmaneuvered. He's got nowhere to go. And the end of 1942, 240,000 remnants of the Axis forces then surrendered to the British and the Americans in what is today Tunisia. It has taken 3.5 years to remove the Axis from North Africa.
What a way to end it. A little bit of sweet revenge at the end, getting them to surrender.
Absolutely.
And of course, on this podcast, we don't glorify war. We just observe it. So that's just the irony of one surrender than the other. JP, as we come to the end, I want to thank you so much for coming on. We're looking forward to seeing you in the future on the Bolios podcast and much more than that to come. For our listeners, JP does have some books coming out. JP, do you want to say a bit more on that just before we close? We'll add links and information, as soon as it's available.
My book on the 2nd South African Infantry Division, the junior division, will be on bookshelves by December. Look for it. It's printed under Sun Media's title or under their publication. Please, if those of you are interested in North Africa, like a lot of us are, it's a unique campaign. It's a unique theatre of operations. And please consider adding it to your Christmas list. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, we will do that. JP, a big thank you, and a big thank you to all our listeners. Bye-bye.